Good afternoon, brethren. Happy Sabbath. Glad to be here with everybody today. I used to think that Samson was just some guy with a temper problem, going around slaying Philistines at every turn, killing lions with his bare hands, doing a lot of fighting. And definitely at first pass, that's how it would appear. Turn with me to Judges 14. Let's see a couple incidents of Samson and his fighting that he has done. Judges 14 in verse 5. It says, "So Samson went down to Timnah with his father and mother and came to the vineyards of Timnah. To his surprise, a young lion came roaring against him, and the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and he tore the lion apart as one would tear apart a young goat, though he had nothing in his hand." And then a little bit later, when he gave a riddle to men of a town and got tricked into giving away the riddle, he fought again, and that was in verse 19. Verse 19, "The Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily, and he went down to Ashkelon and killed 30 of their men, took their apparel, gave the change of clothes to the others." And then again in Judges 15 is another instance of his fighting. In this case, he had just been bound up with ropes. Judges 15:14, "When he came to Lehi, the Philistines came shouting against him. Then the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and the ropes on his arms were like flax that is burned in fire, and his bonds broke loose. He found a fresh jawbone, and he killed 1,000 men." So it's easy to look at him and say, wow, he has more in common with Rambo than with a man of God, right? He seems so unpredictable and so unbridled. But this fighting wasn't just like anger and immaturity. I mean, he had a lot of flaws, but not everything that he did was just rash, bad behavior. And if you don't mind, let's look at those again, because in the story of those fighting, it's easy to miss something. So if we go back again to Judges 14:5, actually 6, the fight starts this way, "And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him." And likewise in verse 19, when he fought the 30 men, "And the Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily." And then again in Judges 15:14, we read all these, but again, it's easy to miss that part. "The Philistines came shouting against him, then the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him," and then he broke the ropes. And so Samson was a warrior, but he was a warrior at God's direction. The Spirit of the Lord led him to fight. And again, not everything that he did was good. He made a lot of bad decisions, but in a lot of cases, he was being led by God's Spirit. And Mr. McLean, during the choir, he was inspiring some of the choir members, and he was telling us about heroes of the Bible in chapter 11 of Hebrews, in the faith chapter. And he didn't mention Samson, but Samson is one of the heroes in the Bible in chapter 11. He's not just a misfit who's there to learn from his bad example, right? He was there in the faith chapter for a reason. God put him there not by mistake. And the message for us today is, don't be afraid to fight. Don't be afraid to fight. Now, most battles nowadays are not physical battles, with the probable exception of the smackdown between Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg that's potentially coming up. But otherwise, most things are not physical nowadays. But it doesn't mean that God doesn't call us to fight in one way or another. When you think about it, that's why we're called now, right? Most of humanity is not called when we're called. They're to be called at a later time in the second resurrection. They're not going to have to fight against Satan. They're not going to have to fight in the sense that they're living in a world that's contrary to God's values. They're going to have a much easier time. But we're placed here in this world now because we're specifically called to fight, right? God says to overcome. You could think of it as a hostile work environment, right? But God didn't put us in a hostile work environment because he didn't like us. He put us here because it gives us an opportunity to grow and an opportunity to overcome. So fighting is a core part of being a first fruit. Now, the opposite of fighting is passivity, right? Neville Chamberlain in World War II, he took it to such a degree that everything that Hitler wanted, he just appeased, and the evil just grew stronger. Right? Passivity didn't work in that case. Our men's club, quite a few years ago, we read a book called The Way of the Wild Heart, and it was the stages of the development of men and their stages of life. And one of the stages was the warrior stage, right? The fighting stage. And he cited passivity as a problem, and he said specifically that that was Adam's problem, right? Because Eve was deceived and she ate. Adam wasn't, but he still ate, right? So that's really a worse thing for him because he was passive. He didn't want to stand up and say, no, we shouldn't do this. He just kind of went along passively. But when we accept sin and evil in parts of our life passively, right, then they're going to grow. We're not called to do that. We're called to do something about it. And the heroes of God are not passive. Jesus in the temple, when he was outside turning over the tables of the money changer, he had zeal for his Father's house, and he was not passive. He's not a wimp, as he's often portrayed. Or likewise, Paul, he's not passive. He talked about putting on the whole armor of God, and he actually lived it out. He lived fighting every day, even though he was beaten and he was threatened and he was stoned. It was a fight for him to get up every day and keep doing what he was doing, not knowing what would happen to him. Or John the Baptist is somebody who was not passive, right? Nobody would mistake John the Baptist with Ned Flanders. I don't know if you guys remember Ned Flanders, this stereotypical wimp who was a Christian and just kind of let everybody walk over him and not really stand up to anything. Nobody would mistake John the Baptist with him when he was out there eating locusts and wild honey and standing up to Herod for the sin that he was committing with his brother's wife. And John the Baptist offended people at times. He didn't want to offend people, but his job was to be that voice crying in the wilderness. And I have a question for you. Why was it important that John the Baptist fought that particular fight? Well, the reason is, if he hadn't pointed out that sin of Herod, the sin would become acceptable. The sin becomes normalized. If nobody says anything, it becomes normalized. And so there are those who are called to push back against that, called to say something. Right? That's part of preaching the gospel. Nowadays, if things aren't called out, they also become normal. And that's why there's the whole debate nowadays about cancel culture, censorship, because people who are doing things that they shouldn't do, they don't want to be called out, right? They want to make it look like there is not even any debate by silencing the people who debate with them. Because if nobody calls them out, then that is normalized. It's no longer thought of as taboo or sinful or wrong, because they're just doing it unopposed. But it's not supposed to be unopposed. It should be opposed, because it shouldn't be normalized. So we're called to preach the gospel, to be witnesses, to say what's right and wrong. And sometimes with the good news or the Beyond Today telecast, sometimes we get backlash. Sometimes we even get banned in places, or episodes are deemed to be illegal, because it doesn't matter if something's in the Bible, if certain topics, you're not supposed to say certain things, and they're illegal, because not everybody lives in a country with the free speech rights that we have. We talk about Christmas sometimes, and people really love their Christmas. We talk about homosexuality. We talk about the trans movement. And sometimes we have backlash, right? We're not trying to offend, but we have to do our job. Winston Churchill said, that courage is the most important virtue because it precedes all the others, right? What good is another virtue that you're afraid to carry out and execute? So don't misunderstand. I'm not saying to go out and be belligerent or rude, but neither should we be embarrassed for what we believe. Now, there are many kinds of fighting, but the most important fight that we face is personal. Right? The most important fight is not preaching the gospel, it's not slaying Philistines, it's personal. Now, I got to experience something a couple months ago called Man Camp that Dave Evans organized, and that was a great experience where several men got together and we talked about our spiritual fight and spiritual things that we were dealing with. And it was a very emotional time where people confided in each other. In fact, it was said, because of all the personal things, what happens at Man Camp stays at Man Camp, so people could feel free to express themselves and not worry about where the information would go. But I did get permission to share the points of a presentation that somebody gave, because the theme of Man Camp this year was being a warrior, that men are warriors. And in certain senses, it's not exclusive to men, but this was a man camp. And so the presenter had several points, and one of them was, there's always a battle. There's always a battle going on. And here he's talking about a personal battle, a personal fight against sin. And the second point was, name the battle that you're fighting. And various battles were discussed: a battle against alcohol, battle against pornography, against laziness, against various other sins. Name the battle that you're fighting. And then the next point, number 3, was you must decide to fight that battle. I'm just giving you the main points. I can't give you the presentation, the whole thing, but it really is worth repeating. And then the last point was to fight the battle every day. Fight the battle every day. Sabbath is a day of rest from work, but this battle, there's no rest from it. Whatever you're trying to overcome, you have to fight that battle every day. So even for Jesus Christ, I would say that his biggest battle was not overturning tables or refuting Pharisees. I would say his biggest battle was also personal, right? When he began his ministry with those 40 days of fasting and Satan came to him, that was a big spiritual battle. Satan was trying to disqualify him, right? And Christ didn't compromise even a little bit. I mean, he could have let those stones be turned into bread. There's nothing in the Bible that says you can't turn stones into bread and eat when you're hungry, right? But he didn't want to compromise even a little bit with Satan. He wanted to make sure that he won that battle, and he did. So, brethren, we, our first fruits, were called at a special time, we're put into special circumstances, and we're called to fight. God gave us a mission to overcome, a unique mission for us as first fruits. So, brethren, don't be afraid to fight.